Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink, it is time for some PathOfExile discussion. So patch 3.19.0 contained a number of completely undocumented loot changes that have thrown most of the veteran player base in PathOfExile into a bit of a frenzy. This is a patch that GGG just announced in the last hour or so, where they're going to address some of these concerns. Now, having a look at this, there's a couple of things it will solve, and I do think if you're a more casual endgame player, let's say that you're someone who's either never beaten the Shaper, or you've only just gotten to the point that you've beaten the Shaper and you feel like Uber Elder and Maven are just completely out of reach. In that case, I think that this will take your experience roughly back to what it was in 3.18. On the flip side, if you're a much more veteran player, either like myself or like someone at the extreme end like Empyrean, then you'll find that this will still represent an overall nerf in loot drops. I'm actually quite fine with that myself. A lot of people will disagree, but I do think that's something that closes the gap between the power gamers and semi-power gamers on the one hand, and the more casual endgamer on the other hand, is something that is a net positive for the game, even though a lot of players will disagree. But let's go through the meat of those changes. So firstly, there's a couple of things that are going to have a big impact in early mapping that is going to fall off by the time you hit to high red tier maps. We've massively increased the rarity bonus for items dropped by monsters with multiple Arch Nemesis mods. This is proportional to difficulty, so there's moderate improvement for 2 mods, large for 3, and huge for 4. Rarity in PathOfExile means that there is a biasing away from scoured items and magic items, and a biasing towards getting rare items and unique items. One thing that's important to say here is that when the game rolls a unique item, it actually checks for this before it determines whether it's going to be an equipable item or whether it's going to be something miscellaneous, like currency, like a map, or like a bunch of other potential items like heist contracts. So whilst I don't expect this to be a big effect, there will be actually a slight reduction in currency drop rates as a result of this change, but something you probably won't notice. Also, you'll likely require more scouring orbs because when a boss does drop a map, it's more likely to be magic. And of course it might be rare, but a lot of people scour rare maps and then chisel them and then elk them anyway. And so that's going to put a little bit more pressure on your scouring orbs. Don't worry, there'll be a little bit of a change that will affect that later. Secondly, basically the same thing is happening to map bosses. So map bosses will now act like act bosses, dropping fewer normal and magic items, many more rare and unique items. This will be good during the point in progression where you still care about the better rare items that drop on the ground. So if you find something like an amethyst ring that's rare, for a period of the game that is genuine loot. After about the time you maybe hit your 5th or 6th tier 15 map, you probably no longer care about those amethyst rings and the like, no longer consider them to be loot, and so therefore you're just no longer interested in them, and this is a nothing change after that point. Next, there is a global increase in the drop rate of unique items by 33%. Again, this will slightly decrease the drop rate of other things like divination cards, like heist contracts, like maps, and like currency, although this will be a very small effect. I would expect this to be less than 1/4%. Next is the big one. We've globally increased the base drop rate of currency items by 25%. Because we removed some drops from past League content, we're giving rare and unique items back from rare and unique monsters, but we're giving currency back from all content in the game. Now, what I think that this is going to mean is that if you are someone who is not really into multi-scarab mapping, you get to endgame, you mostly just elk and go maps, maybe you run the occasional sextant, the occasional scarab when you've got them, but you don't go out of your way to sustain those sorts of mapping methods, and most of the maps that you run are an elk and go strategy, you'll probably end up finding that you get more loot overall as a result of these changes. On the flip side, if you're someone that's a bit closer to the power gamer end of the spectrum like me, and you wind up using a bunch of scarabs to enhance your maps, use sextants and maybe even carefully choose which sextant mods to use, and potentially form groups and use magic find strategies, then in that situation you will find your drops are probably still lower than they were in 3.18. So if you're in that more casual tier, you'll see an increase. If you're in the less casual tier, you'll see a decrease. I actually think this is fine. I personally think that this is a fine change, but it should have been conveyed completely honestly, and that's the fundamental problem that we've got with these changes overall. They were all done by stealth. Next, there's a number of changes that are coming tomorrow rather than today. So there's a reduction in the cost of many harvest crafts and also increases to the level of rewards from the Lake of Kalandra. So those are going to be coming tomorrow. There have already been a few changes to Lake of Kalandra rewards that happened yesterday. They were to the things that do not mirror a League encounter. So this is not things like a breach, this is things like defeat a pack of monkeys and the like. They got a buff yesterday. It was pretty small as far as I can tell, although I haven't tested the limits of it. But tomorrow we're going to see more rewards from the Lake of Kalandra for League reflections. So this is examples like where you get a tile that causes a breach to spawn in the Lake of Kalandra, or a Legion spawn, or things like that. They will drop more loot in the future. Anyways, these changes will be going live mostly today with patch notes coming. I will put a link in the bottom left of the screen now if you're interested in seeing my longer form thoughts on all of the changes and basically the debacle that was 3.19. Otherwise, I'm going to leave it there. May your Valobs have interesting results and don't use them on your loot tables.